Okay, welcome back to COC 1437. This is the second video looking at methods in Java. This video is going to be about creating your user-defined methods. So you creating your own methods in Java. So you've already had some practice with creating a method in Java when you created public static void main. So this is the method. And this method, there's some different parts that a method has. So let's take a look at those parts here in your slides. This is an important slide that you want to make sure and study and know this terminology. So the first thing that we have here is the method heading. In the method heading, you're going to have these two modifiers right here. And you're going to have a return type. You're going to have the name of the method. So this method is called larger. It returns the double. And then it takes, this particular method has two parameters. And these parameters are called formal parameters. Okay. And then this is the body of our method. It's we have an open curly brace and a closed curly brace for the body. So if I look at my program example, the main method is a public method. So it's a public method, it's static, it's void. So void means that it does not return any values. Like the previous one that we looked at, it returns a double. This is the name of the method, main, and then it takes one argument or one parameter, which is a string. And it's actually going to be a string array, which we haven't talked about yet. We'll talk about that later. So that is a heading of a method. So let's take a look at our first example of a method that we're going to create. So this method that I created, so notice here's the start of main and here's the end of main. So after you end main, before this is where we close our class. Close the class. Okay, so this close bracket matches this bracket right here. Okay, and then here we have main, and then we have one method here created. So this method is called print title. Your methods can be called whatever you want to call them. They follow the exact same rules and the way that they look, just like when we create variables and constants. Well, variables, because constants we usually capitalize. This method doesn't return anything, so we write void right here for the return type. And we have something called public and static. So I'm gonna show you the difference. I'm gonna show you what this means. So one of the options that you have when you create a class, and I said this in the last video, is that you can create a method in a class where people who use your class can use that method. Or you can create private ones where you're not allowing people to use that method. You're just creating it for you to use it in your class. So your methods, most of them will have to be public if you're creating a class that somebody else is going to use. So for example, there's a string class, right? And you want to use the method compare to. Well, that has to be a public method. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to use compare to method. Okay. And then static again, I mentioned this last time, static means that if you make it static, you're able to call the method without instantiating an object, without creating an object of the class. So instead of having to create an object, like when we talked about math, instead of having to create a math object, like saying math, object 1 equals new math, instead of having to do that, you just say math.pow. You just call the method itself. So in this example, and actually, when we make it static, we don't even have to put the name of the class and the period, the name of the class and the period, and then the method. We don't even have to do that. So I'll show you the difference with this one. So right now I have static void print title. I have 2 parentheses. I don't have any parameters, so that means I'm not passing anything to the method. All that this method's going to do, it's going to print out the math program. That's all it's going to do. Okay, so every time you call print title, it prints the math program, That's all it does. Every time you click, you call this method. So here's where we call the method. So this is the method call. And I didn't have to put in front of it anything. I just called print title. So let's go ahead and run it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and these other examples, this other method, I'm going to comment it out so that we just run this one, print title. Okay. Run. And all it does is it prints the math program. So if I call it again, print title, and it prints the math program twice. Because that's all that it does. You don't pass it anything, it doesn't return anything. All right, so another type of method that you can create is a method where you don't pass it anything, but it returns a value to you. And that's the next example that I have on here. So this is a menu method. And all that this does is it displays a menu so the user can enter an option. So let me just show you what happens. So when I call this function, this method, it prints 1, add 2 numbers, 2, multiply 2 numbers, and 3, exit. And right now, it doesn't do anything when I enter a 1, 2, or 3. It just tells me what I entered. It says, you entered option 3. Okay, so first of all, let's just print the title one time. So inside here, I do 3 print lines to print my menu options. I get input from the keyboard, and they're going to enter 1, 2, or 3. Whatever it's entered, they could enter 4, 5, whatever integer that is the user decides to enter gets assigned to the variable option. Option is an integer. And then that integer option gets returned. See, here we have the word int. That says this method returns an integer, and it gets returned here. So we call get option, and it returns the option that's entered and assigns it to menu option. And then I print out you entered whatever menu option. So if I enter 1, it says you entered option 1. If I enter 2, it says you enter option 2. If I enter a 5, it says you entered option 5. So if I were actually creating this program and I had 3 options and I would check to make sure that they did not enter a 5 or, anything that wasn't a 1, 2, or 3. But right now we're just wanting to look and see how to create these methods. Okay, so this is a method that returns a value and doesn't take any parameters. So now I want to show you how to create a method that takes a parameter and also returns a value. So you can have it take a parameter and not return anything. That could be an option. So for example, let me do that first. In this print title, I could change this where I give it the title. I could say print title, hello. And then here, well, hello is a string. So I would define a string n. And instead of printing this, I would print n. So it prints hello right there. So what I just did is I passed it hello, which is a string. I pass it to the method. In here, I have to tell it that I'm expecting a string. And so I just create any variable. Doesn't matter what variable I create. Doesn't matter what I name it. I could name it name, n1, whatever. Whatever I name it here, then I have to use it here. Now, what happens, I can also, let me give you another example, something else I can do. Oh, I have to stop the program. Okay. So the other thing that I can do is I can define a string here, string n1 equals hello. And then I can pass it n1. So if I do this, it's so funny. I put my phone on do not disturb and it keeps disturbing me. I don't understand why. Just gonna turn it off. Okay, so I have n1 here. So what happens is here I create in memory, it creates n1 with hello. And here in memory, we create n and n receives hello. So you actually have n1 and n, you have 2 separate objects in memory. When you pass it by value, it's called by value, you have 2 separate values in memory. All right, so here, after we get the option, let's create a method that adds 2 numbers that are entered by the user. All right. So here's where I get my menu option. And then here's where I tell you what I entered. We can leave that there or not, whatever you want to do. So here, I'm going to ask the user, I'm going to say system.out.println. Okay. So I got my menu option. Actually, before I do this, I'm going to say if my menu option is equal to 1, Okay. So what I'm going to ask first, I'm going to ask the user to enter two numbers. And right now, I'm just going to make it work for option 1 and option 2. And then I'll do something different for option 3. And if they enter something that's not correct, okay? So system.println, enter, just because I want to show you how to do this method. Enter an integer. Okay. And I'm going to do a print statement instead of a print line. And then I'm going to make an integer up here, and that integer is going to be num1. So there's two numbers that they have to enter, two numbers to add, two numbers to multiply. So enter an integer, num1 equals okay, now I'm going to do it again, but this time I'm going to do it for the second number. Enter another integer, and then this time will be num2. So now I have num1 and num2, and I don't really care to know what option they entered, so I'm going to delete that. If many option equals 1, then I'm going to call a method to add two numbers. And I'm just making up the name of this method. You can call it anything you want. And this add two numbers is I'm going to pass it num1 and num2. So these two numbers that I enter, I'm going to pass it to this method. And the method is going to calculate the value for us. And it's going to return it. So I can say sum equals, and I can define sum as an integer. Okay. Sum equals add two numbers. And then after it adds those two numbers and it returns the sum of them, then I want to output the sum. So system.out.println sum is sum. Okay, so the method that I have to create is this one right here. Add two numbers, return sum, and it takes two integers. So I'm going to make this public because I want anybody who uses my class. And I haven't created a class yet for these methods. I'm putting everything in this one. I mean, I guess I'm creating this class right here, but I'm not actually creating a specialized class that I'm going to share with anybody and everybody to then create their to create an object and call the methods. So I'm going to make it public, static. It returns an integer, which is the sum. The name of the method is called add two numbers. I'm just going to copy it, so I make sure that I spell it exactly the same. Otherwise, it's going to give me an error. It's not going to have a semicolon at the end. And then here, I can name these variables the same, or I can change the names of the variables. Even if I name the variables the same, they're going to be two separate num1s and two separate num2s. So here in main, the scope of these two variables is the main function, the main method. And in this this num1 and num2, the scope, or meaning where I can use them, is here in this method. So even though they have the same name, we have 4 variables. 1 variable, 2 variables, 3 variables, 4 variables, even if it's the same name. If that's confusing to you, just change the name, and it's still 4 separate variables, 4 memory locations. So we have open and close brace. Now we're going to write the body of this method. And this time here we said option equals return option. I'm going to do it all in one step. I'm going to say return n1 plus n2. So that returns the sum of the 2 numbers. The other way that you can do it is you can say create an integer, say n1 plus n2, return s. So you can do it like this, or you can do it like this. This is multiple steps. I'm going to do it the easiest way. So when it adds the two numbers, they get assigned to this variable called sum, and then that variable gets displayed right here. Now, I do want to show you as I'm programming, I keep all of the variables that I define, I keep them together. So all these are variables that have been defined and the string object. And then I can start with calling my methods. Print title, call get option. I then have 2 inputs. So notice that I'm putting some white space here. I'm kind of dividing where my variables are versus my method calls, versus enter an integer, calling next int, and then my if statement. So right now we're only looking at option 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. So it says class interface or enum expected. So it's expecting there's something wrong with, it's pointing at the very last curly brace. And what that means that is somewhere I either have too many or too little curly braces. So to fix this problem, I'm just going to look to make sure that my braces match, okay? So right now, this brace, so if I click on this one, it says this is the match. That's correct. If I click on this one, it says that's the match. That's correct. If I click on that one, that's the match. If I click on that one, that's the match. So it looks like I have 1 extra brace. If I click on this last one, it matches this one. Do you see how it's like highlight, kind of outlined in green? So anytime you click on a brace, it gives you the previous match. Okay, so it says variable sum might not have been initialized. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So here's the variable sum, which is an integer. And then we say sum equals. So we'll just set it to 0 and see if it allows us. Well, I think I know what it's saying. So because we have an if statement, if you press a 2, 3, or anything that's not a 1, then sum is going to be, it's going to print out something, some junk here. So that's why it gave us that error. Okay, so if I press 1 is the only thing I've programmed, then it's going to ask me for 2 numbers. I'm going to enter 2 and a 3. This is the sum is 5. So then the next thing I want to do is I want to check to make sure that the person only enters a 1, 2, or 3. So that's going to be a loop. So I'm only going to ask for the numbers if they enter a 1 or a 2. So I'm going to say do but first of all, I'm going to say if menu option is not equal to a 1, or I could say or 2 or 3, or I can say, it's many ways to do this. You can say is menu option greater than or equal to 1, and menu option less than or equal to 3. This is why I'm telling you, everybody has to create their own program, because there's so many ways. Like I'm doing this, but there's many other ways to create the same program. You may be thinking, oh, I would do it totally different. Exactly. So now we're looking, so if menu option is greater than or equal to 1 and less than or equal to 3, then we're going to go in here and do all this right here. So it's a menu, so I want to keep the menu going. So I'm going to say do enter an integer, enter another integer, see what menu option is, print out the menu option. So I'm going to do this while oh, get option is not in here. So I have to call it. So I'll call it here and then I check, and I'm gonna have to call it again. So if it's greater than 1, so I want to do all this and then call it again. And then say while menu option is not equal to 3. Because if it's equal to 3, then we want to exit. So we call menu. Let's say that I enter a 2. Is 2 greater than or equal to 1? Yes. Is it less than or equal to 3? Yes. Then it asks me to enter an integer, another integer. If menu option equals 1, well, that's false. It's not a 1. So sum is just going to be 0. It's going to ask me for menu option again. And then it's going to stop if, oh, and I'm missing a curly brace right here. So this curly brace goes with the do while menu option is not equal to 3. Okay, let's try it. So I'm going to enter 1, 3, 4. It says the sum is 7. Then it's asking me again to enter a number. So let's go ahead and enter a 5. So it took a 5. So something went wrong. Let's find out what went wrong. Because it shouldn't take a 5. It exited on 3. Okay, so if it's greater than or equal to 1 and less than or equal to 3. Oh, I see. We don't check again. So when we're inside the loop, the do while, it's not checking. So what we can do is we're going to take this off and we're going to move the do statement above the if statement. Let's say do. So call the menu, check to see if it's a good menu number. There we go. So this while starts right there. Okay, so now we run it. 1, 2, 3, 5. And 5 does not do anything. So it just shows me the menu again. I'm gonna put 2. Now remember when I put 2, it's just gonna give me yeah. So the sum is just gonna be the old sum because I haven't told it what to do with if I press 2, I actually have to do 4 times 3 and haven't told it to do that. So here, I initialize sum to 0 the first time, but then in the loop, it's just going to keep whatever sum. If we pressed a 1, it's going to keep this sum. So I have to code the next one. So to code the next one, I would say, let me exit the program. Okay, so to code the next one, I would do the same thing that I did here. Copy, paste, except I would say multiply. 2 numbers. Instead of an addition sign, I would do multiplication. And then here, I would call else if menu option is equal to 2. And sum is probably not a good variable. Maybe I should call it result. That way it applies to anything, whether I add or multiply, or later on if I want to subtract and divide. So I could change this to result and this to result, but it doesn't matter. It's just a variable. So if I press 2, 7, 2, then it should give me 14, and it does. And I should say the result is 14 instead of the sum is 14. Okay. Oh, and for some reason my 3 is not exiting right away, so I would look at that and fix that. But here you've got your method calls. So this is a method that's void, and you only have one parameter. This is a method that returns a value, returns the sum, and you pass it 2 numbers. This one returns the product, and you pass it 2 numbers. So the other thing that we want to look at is terminology of actual and formal parameters. These are the formal parameters. So when you're in the method, those are called the formal parameters. When you call the method, that is called the actual parameters. So this is the actual parameters. They're over here in main, like num1 and num2 is an actual parameter. And then, oh, excuse me. The formal parameters would be these 2 right here. This is the return value. This is what we call a local variable, meaning that this variable max, the scope of it is this method. So you cannot use this variable anywhere outside in other methods or like main unless you declare it again. So looking at this is the method call. These are the actual parameters. Method call, actual parameters. So you could pass it two numbers, you could pass it two variables, or you could pass it a number and a variable. Just that you pass it what it's expecting. If it's expecting integers, pass it integers. If it's expecting, if you define it as double and you pass it in integers, okay. If it's expecting strings, then you pass it strings. Again, this is our method definition. Public static return type, name of method, two parameters. These are two doubles. It checks to see if x is greater than or equal to y. If it is, it returns x. If y is greater than x, then it returns y. So it's returning the larger of the two numbers. This is showing you another way of doing the same thing. Here you have if else, here you have if and no else statement. So here's talking about a palindrome. A palindrome is an integer or a string that reads the same forward or backward. The method is palindrome takes a string as a parameter and it returns true if the string is a palindrome. It returns a false otherwise. So to define is a palindrome, the return type would be bool, B-O-O-L, bool, because it returns true or false. And it says that it takes a string, so it has one parameter and it's a string value. So here's how you would implement that. Public static Boolean is palindrome. It's receiving a string. Here's the code, and then it returns true or it returns false. If it's a palindrome, it returns true. Flow of execution. Execution always begins with the first statement in the method main. So we always start with the main method. Used to define methods execute only when they're called. Call to the method transfers control from the caller to the called method. So if you're in main and you call a method, then you go and you transfer control to the method. When the method's done, you come back to the main program. In method call statement, specify only actual parameters, not data type or method type. So when you're calling a method, you don't have to specify the method type. So, or the data type. You just specify the actual parameters. When you are done with the method, when it's done, the control goes back to whoever called that method. So if main called the method, you go back to main. You can take a look at this sample program, largest number. What was it called? Well, the largest of 10 numbers. I was looking for the largest of 10 numbers. Oops, going the wrong way. So we talked about void methods. These are methods that don't return any values. You can use the return statement, but only to exit the method early, not to return an actual value. So here's an example. You have your modifiers, which is public If you want it to be public method, static, void, method name, parameter list, it can be there or not. Here's how we call the method that doesn't return a value. A formal parameter receives a copy of its corresponding actual parameter. So that's what we talked about. When you when you call a method, you're passing it two variables. You're passing the value, so you have to create two new variables. If a formal parameter is a reference variable, meaning an object, copies value of corresponding actual parameter. Value of actual parameter is address of the object where actual data is stored. Both formal actual parameters will refer to the same object. So what that means is the following. I'm going to draw it out for you because it's easier to understand. So if I have int n1 and int n2 and int num1 and int num2, that would be four separate variables. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's say the method call has n1 and n2. And when I define the method, I call them num1. Sorry, this doesn't write really well. And num2. So I've got four separate memory locations. But when you're dealing with objects and you pass an object, like a string object, so if you have string n, and you're passing that to string name, then what you're passing is the address. So the address where the name is, let's say the name is over here somewhere, and address FFE0. Then N is going to have the address FFE0, and name is going to have the address FFE0. Because and when you pass N to name, because you're passing the address, not the actual value. So both of these will point to where the actual name is. Let's say the name here is Joe. So these two will point to FFE0. Okay. We'll talk about reference variables in just a little bit. So let me get back to that because I haven't showed you an example yet of a reference variable. I mean, I guess I just talked about the string variable. That's a reference variable. So string str equals hello. So when we pass it a reference variable, you're just passing the address of where that string is in memory. So if in main you have a variable called str, but then your parameter in your method is called pstr, then they're both going to contain the address of where hello is. Here they're talking about the class string buffer. It contains the method append, which allows you to append a string to an existing string. and the method delete, which allows you to delete all the characters of the string. The assignment operator cannot be used with string buffer variables. You must use the operator new to allocate memory space for a string. So you would have to say, let's say str1 string buffer equals new string buffer. So here's string buffer, str equals new string buffer, and then the name of, and then the string. Primitive type wrapper classes as parameters. So we talked about the integer wrapper class and how there's a double wrapper class and a character wrapper class. So if a formal parameter is of the primitive data type, and the corresponding actual parameter is a variable, then the formal parameter cannot change the value of the actual parameter. So let's look and see what that means. Let's look at this very first bullet point. What it's saying is, if you have a primitive data type like int n1 and int n2, and a primitive data type over here called num1 and num2, because these are ints, num1 in no way will change the value of n1 because they're just two separate variables, completely separate variables, separate memory locations. That is what that first bullet point is saying. Only reference variables can pass values outside the method. So if it's a reference variable, then, for example, I just like open the PowerPoint. PowerPoint's open. So if it's a reference variable, like here, let me see, like right here. Okay, we were looking at this earlier. So str contains the address. Well, not that one. Str contains the address of where hello is. PSTR contains the address of where hello is. So in this case, I can change the address of where str points, and I can change the address of where PSTR points. So both, I can change those two addresses. Okay, let's fast forward. Only reference variables can pass values outside the method. Corresponding to each primitive data type, Java provides a class so that the values of primitive data types can be wrapped in objects. So we talked about that already in another video. The wrapper classes. The class integer does not provide a method to change the value of an existing integer object. The same is true of other wrapper classes. So if you wrap an integer, remember we said we cannot change the value of that integer anymore. It's now an object and we cannot change the value of it. If we want to pass a string object as a parameter and also change that object, we would have to use the string buffer class. Java does not provide any class that wraps primitive type values in objects. Java does not provide any class that wraps primitive type values in objects and when passed as parameters changes their value. So it's saying basically anytime you convert your primitive type and you wrap it as an object, you cannot change the value. If a method returns only one value of a primitive type, then you can write a value returning method. And so a value returning method is this right here. This is a value returning method. It returns the sum. So if you have something here like int, char, string, double, it means you're returning a value. If you encounter a situation that requires you to write a method that needs to pass more than one value of a primitive data type, then you should design your own classes. Appendix D provides a definition of such classes and shows how to use them in a program. Okay, the scope of an identifier within a class. So we talked about this as I was showing you the different methods. The scope means of where can you actually use that variable. So let's look at this example again. The scope of N1 and N2 is the method add two numbers. This is the only place you can use N1 and N2. If you try to use it up here in main, it's going to give you an error because it's not defined here. And this N1 right here is a string. So this N1 string is different than this N1 over here. So the scope of this is a separate, two separate variables, two other locations. And so those memory locations are, the scope of those is only in this method. The scope of the variable option is only in this method. The scope of N is only in this method. The scope of menu option num1, num2, sum, N1 is the main method. That's what it means by scope. Here it's just saying anytime you declare a variable inside an open and a close brace, that's where the scope of the variable is going to be. So right here, if we say int x and we declared it outside of this block, we cannot declare another x because it's already declared here. We can use x in here. We can say x equals 10, but we cannot declare it again. But if I don't declare it here and I declare it here in this block, then I can only use it in this block. Can't use it outside the block. Scope rules of an identifier declare within a class and access within the method block of the class. And if I let's see. So it's saying if you declare a variable, like here we're declaring N1 here, you can use it starting here, you can use it starting there all the way to the end of main. But if you were to declare a variable here, like if you say int p, then well actually that's inside the loop. But if I declare it here, int p, I cannot use that variable here. I can't say p equals 0 because it starts from the top and it goes down. And so it hasn't, if I say p equals 0, we haven't defined the variable yet. So that would be invalid. If x is declared without the reserved word static, such as a named constant or a method name, then it cannot be accessed in a static method. If x is declared with the reserved word static, such as a named constant or a method name, then it can be accessed within a method block, provided the method block does not have any other identifier named x. So here's an example. public class scope rules, we defined double as a constant. That's why it says final, and is static. Z is static, T is static. In public static main, we define num. We define X and Z as doubles, and we define CH. Then in this method, which is a void method, we're using X, or we're defining an X and we're defining a Y, which are two separate variables. They're not these variables up here. So here we have method 1, method 2. In method 2, we have X equals 12. So X is defined here in the main method. So let's take a look and see the rules for these. So we have rate. Rate is defined before main. So rate can be used visible in one meaning the method called 1, yes. It's visible in the method called 2. It's visible in block 3 and in main. So because main is defined before, or rate is defined before main, then we call that a global variable, meaning that, what was I? Here we go. So any variables that you have before main here are global and can be used anywhere after that. So they can be used here. They can be used anywhere here. Now, Z, oh, the other thing too is that rate is not redefined anywhere else. See, Z right here is global, but then this Z, then there's another Z defined. This is a different one right here. So Z before main is visible in the method 1, not in method 2, not in the block of method 3, and not in main. So this Z right here. T before main is visible everywhere. But this T right here is not redefined anywhere else. So it's just visible. It's visible everywhere. So those are our 3 global variables. Then we have the local variables of main. So main has 1, 2, 3, 4 local variables. These 4 local variables can be used in main and they can be used in the other blocks or visible in the other blocks. Sorry, not the local variables. The local variables are only used in main. That's it. Sorry about that. I was like, that doesn't seem right. So num, x, z, and ch can only be used in main. They cannot be used in method 1, method 2, or block 3. one method name can be used everywhere. So the name of the method, you can call the method anywhere, but X which is a formal parameter in one. So this X right here can only be used in the one method. So it can only be used in the one method. It cannot be used in the two method, cannot be used in the block 3 or in main. X can only be used here in this method called one. CH and A can only be used in this method called two. 1 and Z can only be used in this method here. And X can only be used in this block. Okay. So when we talk about parameters, I would definitely go back and look at examples and make sure you understand what is the scope of the parameter. Method overloading, it means more than one method can have the same name. So if you have a method, call it method 1, you can overload it and have it have two functions, make it do two different things. Two methods are said to have different formal parameter lists if both methods have a different number of formal parameters, or if the number of formal parameters is the same, then the data type of the formal parameters in the order you list must be different. So you can have a method called one that has no parameters, a method called one that has two parameters, a method called one that has three parameters. And we've seen that in some of the methods that we've used that are provided by Java, especially when you use constructors. So you can construct objects, empty objects, or objects with certain parameters. Like you can construct a string, an empty string, or you can construct a string with actual numbers. So all these methods have different names, method 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they also have different formal parameters lists. This one has an X, X, Y, all different names, all different types of parameters. The method 6 and method 7 both have 3 formal parameters, and the data type is the same. These methods all have the same formal lists. So this has an int and an int, a double and a double, and C, a char and a char. Creating several methods within a class with the same name. The signature of a method consists of the method name and its parameter list. Two methods have different signatures if they have either different names or different formal parameter lists. Note that the signature of a method does not include the return type of the method. So this is the following method headings correctly overload the method XYZ. So this method XYZ here has no parameters. This has an int and a double and an int, a double, and a char. So we can overload it. We can have the same name if we have different parameter lists or different parameters in different orders. Here we have method ABC. They both have int X and double Y. So they have the same parameter list. These method headings to overload the method ABC are incorrect. So we cannot do this because they have the same parameters. Even though they have different return types, they have the same parameters. So this is going to give you an error. Now, if you had double here and double y and int x, then that would work. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. This is going to be the end of this video. Please go back, like I said, and really work with the methods. It's so important that you know how to create methods, because from now on, I'm going to require all your programs to have methods. And to create classes, you got to have methods, because classes, remember, inside a class, we encapsulate the data and the methods. And those methods are going to be accessing that data and getting the values, maybe making calculations with those values. So you have to make sure that you understand how to create these methods. Right. Have a good evening. Thank you. This. Show and